In the last month, I've had the same conversation with two different people that seems to me, they say when for every one letter you get, there's 100 people who thought about writing you. So two people have brought to me the same issue, which I actually feel is a universal one and really needs to be addressed. And it's a little delicate because so many things on the spiritual path have both sides. I remember I have given a class on occasion about how to receive and trust your inner guidance. And the whole course is, well, this could be true, and then, of course, then the opposite could be true, and then this could be true, and then, of course, the opposite could be true. You can tell your guidance is true if everything goes smoothly, and the other way you can tell it's true is that if there's nothing but obstacles. You can tell if it's true if everyone agrees with you, and then you can tell if it's true if no one agrees with you. So these are not things that can be, the path of self-realization cannot be reduced to dogma. It's much more challenging for that reason, because it's not as if we can simply find out who we're supposed to be and then mold ourselves to that reality. A friend of mine who was in a very traditional monastery for quite a few years said at the beginning she tried to express herself, but immediately learned that nobody wanted her to. So what she did is she tried to figure out who other people wanted her to be, and then because she was very good at becoming who they wanted her to be, she became very popular and successful, except she wasn't being herself. And after like 20-some years, she had to withdraw because it wasn't her. In even the context of Ananda, at different times when Swamiji, and I'm going to talk now not about our church, this was all before we had this kind of expression, when we were one rural community, and to be a member meant to come live in the community in, relatively speaking, isolated circumstances. So it was more difficult to integrate many various forms. The life we have now opens the door much wider to many more people because you can bring into it as much of yourself as you want, and the rest of you can do whatever it wants, which is all to the good and all to the terrible. Both sides are positive. But when we were living in the rural community, when somebody came to live with us and we were all isolated together, it mattered a lot. It was like when Saint Teresa of Avila established her convents, 12 women who went into a perpetual state of cloister. She said to the mothers that would be setting up those convents, great care must be exercised in the selection of those 12 women. Interestingly, she said, look above all for common sense. This is interesting, hundreds of years ago. She said, even devotion can be learned. But if they don't have common sense, it'll be an endless difficulty for you. Interesting, right? Okay, now coming back to where I was, when we were in our community there, which was more isolated, Swami began to tell us we needed to be more selective about who we took in. We were becoming limited by the county's regulations and so on. And so people wanted then let's write out what the criteria is. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And he said, no, if you write it down and people can read it, then they'll know what's expected of them and they'll simply behave that way. And he said it'll lead, among other things, to hypocrisy. He said just allow people to be themselves and observe what their natural inclinations are. And then from that, one can begin to discern. Now, of course, as Swami said elsewhere, only a few people can actually manage things by pure intuition. Almost everyone else needs a few rules. So on the path of self-realization, we're sort of in a balancing act, because if it doesn't come from our own intuitive understanding, sooner or later, something will break it. That's the only way I can put it. When I lived 16 years in that isolated community up in Nevada City, which is still there, somewhat less isolated than it was during my tenure, into this environment here, I was immensely curious as to whether the essential reality of that life would transfer. And I was enormously gratified after a very short period of time to observe that it transferred perfectly. And Swami Kriyananda commented the same way. He said, the fact that you see the same spirit of dedication and devotion everywhere in Ananda, no matter what the context, is a sign that the Master's power is going with us wherever we go. And it was such a sweet way to put it. It has nothing to do with our quality as human beings. It has to do with the fact that if we are receptive, Master's presence is wherever two or more are gathered in my name. That's how Jesus put it. Where two or more are gathered in my name, there shall I be, there am I in the midst of them. Meaning that the divine is wherever we draw him. As Swami Kriyananda also commented on one of the celebrations for Master's Mahasamadhi, the day of his passing. Swami said, we tend to think of Master as existing in that body at some particular point in time. But he said the actual center of Master's presence is in our own heart when we call on him. Because I think I was talking last week, it's a radio broadcast that goes out that remains dispersed until it's drawn to a focus. And so any of us who draw that presence to a focus, then we are as much with Master as anyone ever could be. Swami commented interestingly, he said, even when we were with Master when he was incarnated in his body, which Swami Kriyananda had that experience from 1948 to 1952, which very few people still on the planet ever even met Master. And he said, even then, he said, you would be standing next to his physical body or in the proximity of it. He said, but what Master was, and the phrase he used was an emanation of divine energy that came through that body. The word emanation is a very interesting one. There's a passive quality to it, which it simply is the nature of the being to emanate like that. And that's how he described him. And therefore, that's entirely independent of the physical window through which that was passing. Master said, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple now but God. It's a very interesting way to think about it, isn't it? That he animated a body that had a face, that had a name, but there was only one force of energy coming through it. Now to come back where I was saying these conversations that I had two of, all had to do with the skill or the lack of it in meditation. And meditation, in every way, is the defining reality of the path of self-realization. And we naturally make a very big point of it. And when Swamiji was talking about when the whole idea of calling Ananda a church rather than a collection of communities, the idea was so that people everywhere would understand, I can be part of this. And in the original little document, which was nothing more than a pamphlet that he wrote, he talked about loving God, dedicating yourself to God, and he talked about doing something active in order to make that relationship more than just an idea in your mind. And meditation is the obvious definition of that practice, because what we're doing when we meditate, most of the time, just because of the way we're made, and everyone is invited to register a complaint on this point. You can just file it wherever you think it will serve and see if it gets you anywhere, but go ahead. The way we're made, our orientation is outward. It's just our senses are turned outward. I've shared with you, for those of you who've had children and given birth to a baby, or the father, or been there, it's so astonishing to me that as soon as the child comes out of the womb, most children waste no time at all getting involved with what's going on around them. They either crawl up to the mother's breast so they can begin to feed, they just begin to reach out. I saw an astonishing picture, which was so beautiful and moving, of there was a baby in the womb, 7 months in the womb, and it started having that thing where the spinal cord divides. I can't remember the name of it. But in any case, they did an operation in utero to repair that so that the child could develop naturally and be born. So in the amazing way they can do, they actually took the womb out, opened it up, operated on this tiny little child, and then put it all back together, and it worked. Okay. At one point, there was a photographer. This was a huge thing, as you can imagine. I'm sure you can look this up on the internet. At one point, that little baby reached its hand out and grabbed the hand of the doctor. So you have this picture of the womb, this tiny hand holding like that. And then there's a little description of how almost everyone in the surgery room completely lost it and had to gather themselves together to finish. Yeah, and the little baby's saying thank you. That's how the surgeon felt it. Thank you. But from the very beginning, even in utero, we're looking out. Now, there's a good reason for that. Swamiji describes this also in the Path, where he says it's not only necessary for self-realization, he said, and it's just a very interesting, there's so many things in these great books. You read Autobiography of a Yogi, you read The Path, you read The Essence of Self-Realization, you read The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita, and you just find one sentence in there, but there's one sentence in The Path where Swami's talking about spiritual family, and he's talking about these great nations, spiritual nations, he calls them, that build up around these great masters over many incarnations. And he talks about Yogananda's family being one of these great spiritual nations, so large that even within Yogananda's family there are these subgroups. You know, Dayamata had her own group, Swami Kriyananda has his own group, and there's all disciples of Lahiri who are not part of Yogananda's family, but part of Babaji's family, all of these little families. But Swamiji said one of the reasons that these families develop is that self-realization, it's necessary not only to completely spiritualize our inner relationship with the divine, but also to spiritualize our relationship to the objective world, especially with one another. And that these relationships that we form in our gradual learning unconditional love, which is much easier in the abstract than it is in the specific, we can all just, you know, as the joke goes, you know, it's I love humanity, it's people I can't stand. You know, we can have this kind of abstract affection for all of God's children until one of them spills coffee on us or whatever they do, because they are inclined to do that. They are inclined to challenge. And so our true spirituality, as Gyanamata said, is tested in the cold light of day. So our outward focus is also to our benefit, because in actual real life interaction, we find out just how calm and peaceful and loving and accepting and how much faith we have. So this habit of outward motion is to our karmic benefit, but also it leads us astray. And it makes us think that reality begins from outside. Many years ago, I had a friend who was outside of the spiritual path, but a person very dear to me. And we used to enjoy having philosophical conversations, but we would reach this irresolvable impasse between us, which we couldn't cross, because his essential belief was that the outside world is the real world, and wisdom is to adjust yourself to it. And I already knew at that point that reality emanates from inside myself, and the way to adjust to the outside world is to first attend to the inner world. But he was simply not a meditative man. And the idea of ceasing all stimulation, you know, closing your eyes, closing your ears, being in silence, stilling your body, then even more trying to withdraw your thoughts from external activity, it was lunacy to him. It wasn't merely difficult, it was what would be the possible point in that. So there is this dividing line on the path of self-realization where first, by some intuitive understanding, we begin to get that it's all about consciousness. And consciousness is first an individual and a primary reality. So the decision we make may manifest itself as meditation, and it's very wise for it to manifest that way. But the decision even to meditate requires something even more fundamental, which is, I am responsible, that I am center, that the divine is center everywhere, circumference nowhere, that within me, in Autobiography of a Yogi, when Master has this experience of cosmic consciousness, which he describes in that book as his first experience of cosmic consciousness, there's a certain amount of, I don't know what you would call it, disingenuous, dissembling, I'm not quite sure what the word is, where Master pretends to be something he's not quite, or less than he actually is. He just presents himself as a humble devotee. It's not dishonest, it's just incomplete. So when Sri Yukteswar gives him this experience of cosmic consciousness, and he starts describing how everything that he thought was solid just turns into shimmering light, and he describes looking through the walls of the ashram and looking through the fence and seeing the cow going down Raigat Lane, I believe it was, there on its way to the Ganges, and how it would go behind the wall and he could just see right through the wall, and because it was all just light, like this. And he talks about this just extraordinary reality, and he says the center of the imperium, whatever that word actually means, I'm not quite sure, imperium, he perceived to be a point of intuitive perception in his own heart. He's seeing all of creation on a level he's never seen before, and he realizes that the whole thing emanates from a point of intuitive perception in the center of his own being. So somehow, somewhere, to get onto the path of self-realization, to have a guru, to even want to meditate, to have it even cross your mind that I need to separate myself from this world, and what you're actually doing is you're rising above it. You're getting above it by getting to the point from which it emanates, which is this intuitive perception in my own heart. And then we begin the process. And it's, well, I was in a taxi cab in Chicago. I'd flown in from California to do a program at some place there. This was a number of years ago. And sometimes when people ask me about myself, I tell them more of what I do, and sometimes I don't. In this particular reason, I don't know why, but the taxi driver asked me what I was doing or what I did, and I said I'd come to teach a meditation seminar or something like this. In his Chicago way, he said, oh yeah, I tried to meditate. I tried, it didn't work. Just like that, and I thought, wow, I bet it didn't, you know? So I just told him that a little instruction is helpful, but the conversation didn't go farther. But a little instruction is helpful, because when we suddenly just decide to reverse the entire flow of energy of incarnations, sometimes that flow of energy just kind of laughs at us. You know, it's like saying, oh, I think I'll be an opera singer. You know, look, dentists make a lot of money. I think I'll be a dentist. You know, it's like there's something in between that has to happen before that enormous benefit is there. People who have that kind of benefit have gone step by step by step. And if they appear to have a natural knack for it when they're born, it's because in lifetimes before, they put in all that work. There's no shortcuts anywhere. They don't always show in one lifetime, but there are no shortcuts. So then we decide that we're going to meditate, and we get instruction, and we try it, and I'll be darned if it just isn't that easy, you know? But what the mistake is, and here's the conversation I've been having, because I am not skillful at one aspect of the spiritual path, therefore I have failed at the spiritual path. And it doesn't really matter how well you meditate. You can be the worst meditator in the world. Your meditation is going to be 30 seconds, in the morning and 30 seconds at night. And that's 100 million times better than the single thought that you have failed on the spiritual path. And we don't even know what we're being tested on. That's what makes the spiritual path so tricky. We just can't have this layer of, if I pass this, then I'm here, and then after I do that, then I'm here, and then if I get a bishop's hat, then I'm here, I can be a cardinal or whatever it is, and it's just so clear. Like, you're behind me, you're ahead of me, I'm standing here, I'm this good, I'm not as bad as you, and I'm not as good as them. That's what we're always trying to do. We just spend all our lives weighing and measuring. I think another word for Maya is the measurer. Just always trying to evaluate it by a system that has no relationship to our actual reality. I think it's great if you can meditate well. Meditation is really nifty. It's just terrific. It helps you so much to be able to do it. Being nice is also good. Loving other people is also good. Staying calm, not getting so hysterical about things, that's also good. But none of it, in the end, actually makes any difference at all. All of it is a means to an end. I remember, this is years ago, when I was still living with the group of women in the convent at Ananda village. This was like in the 70s. And one of our sisters was a feisty sort. All of my sisters were a feisty sort, but this one stood out. And she was being particularly crabby for a fairly long period of time. And finally, I was designated to speak to her because we were close. And I sort of said, you haven't been as much fun as you can be. This hasn't been a happy time. And so with great seriousness, she said, I just am having so much trouble meditating. It just isn't working. And she just became, as we do, quite intent about it and quite justified in her sense of despair, because after all, meditation is so important. And I looked at her and I said, wow, when I'm having trouble meditating, I try to do everything else as well as I can. In her mind, all of her impatience and unpleasantness and so on was all perfectly justified, because after all, she was failing in a fundamental way, and therefore darkness was justified. I said, if I'm failing in a fundamental way, I try to make the rest of it as good as I can. Retrieve what I can out of the mess. Complete opposite reactions. Not that I was always so smart, but in that particular one, I understood it. The only way you can fail on the spiritual path, there isn't actually any way to fail on the spiritual path. Comparatively speaking, is to forget that you are unconditionally loved by God and to rejoice at all times in that fact. Anything, no matter how egregious, that persuades you even for a nanosecond that therefore you are justified in being unhappy because you are separated from God, that is the only error there is. Which means we should be happy all the time, no matter what. Contemplate unconditional. Unconditional is an extraordinary word. Unconditional means, it means unconditional. It means there are no conditions that can interrupt it, no matter how stinky we behave. And we all are stinkers sometimes. We're either stinkers in the privacy of our own house, or we're big public stinkers, Sometimes we just are. The most amazing thing about Ananda is nobody ever goes away. Most of the time when people have some big catastrophe in their life, they get to change cities or countries or at least churches or something. But here we're just stuck. We're the only Ananda church in the area, so you can't even go anywhere else. You just have to hang around and be mortified. And now that we're global and we have the internet, everybody knows. You can't even go anywhere else. Everybody knows. And what's the big, response? So what? So what? It's just one more way. All God is, Satan has just one trick. He clothes it in 1,000 different ways. Satan is our own false reasoning. And he's very clever. And if we're clever, Satan is really clever because he gets right inside our mind and uses all those little beautiful synapses and all those things we know to persuade us that this time, we are the only being on the planet that is not loved by God. And it's a fact. Like that, right? Because after all, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this. What difference does it make? Eventually you'll get it right. We can waste a few million years, and that's unpleasant, but eventually we will get it right. Because if even this much, you know that you are unconditionally loved by God, worlds will crash around you. But when you hit the bottom, deeper than that bottom is the love of God. This is what Betsy said to Corrie ten Boom when the two of them were incarcerated in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany as Christians who'd helped Jews. And they ended up in as close to hell as this world can provide. And Betsy died, and Corrie lived. And Betsy told Corrie, she said, after this is over, you will, because she could see it. She could see that she was going to die and her sister wasn't. You will travel the world, and you will tell them all that no matter how deep the darkness may appear, the love of God is deeper still. And then Betsy said to Corrie, and they will believe you because you've been here. And take it a step further, that's why you're here. Because from this, you will know that nothing in this world is bigger, stronger, more true, more real than the fact that we are unconditionally loved by God. Don't take a free ride. Do your best, But if your best is 30 seconds in front of that altar saying, I'm so glad you love me no matter what, that's enough if that's your best. Just remember that. That's all God asks of us ever. God bless you.